He lived a quiet life in a small southern town, the kind of place where people waved at each other from their driveways and news spread faster than the mail. Most neighbors only knew him as the man who kept to himself, always polite but distant. He rented a small house on the edge of town, near a patch of woods and a long gravel road. Every morning, like clockwork, he took his dog for a walk right after sunrise. The dog was a strong Belgian Malinois, with dark fur and alert eyes that seemed to understand every word his owner said. To him, that dog was more than a pet. It was family, a lifeline that kept him steady when the rest of the world felt too heavy. The two shared a bond that went beyond words. People who saw them together often said it looked like they could read each other's thoughts. The man had moved to that quiet town 3 years earlier. He didn't talk much about his past, but there were clues that told a story. The way he stood, straight-backed even when he was relaxed. The way his eyes scanned the street when he walked. The way he noticed small details, like a car parked where it usually wasn't or a door left open down the block. He carried himself with the calm confidence of someone who had been through things most people couldn't imagine. Inside his home, everything was neat and organized. There were no photos on the walls, just a few old medals and a folded flag on a shelf. He didn't like to talk about what those medals meant, and no one asked. The neighbors respected his privacy. He was the kind of person who helped without being asked, cutting a fallen branch for an elderly neighbor, fixing a loose gate, or checking someone's tire pressure before a storm. But after that, he went back to his quiet life with his dog. The dog, his loyal companion, had been with him since the last year of his military service. They had trained together, lived together, and saved each other's lives in more ways than one. When he left the service, the dog came home with him. Over time, the dog became his only real family. He didn't have children, and he rarely spoke to his relatives. That animal was the one being on earth that truly understood him. Every morning started the same. He woke up early, made coffee, and sat on the porch while the sky turned from black to pink. His dog sat beside him, ears perked, watching the world wake up. The man often talked to him softly, telling him about the day ahead or just enjoying the silence between them. He liked routine. It made him feel safe. It made life predictable. But routine can sometimes hide the things that go wrong. One quiet morning, things began as usual. He brewed his coffee, stretched, and put on his old jacket. His dog wagged his tail, ready for their daily walk. They went down the gravel path, turning toward the woods where the air smelled like pine and rain. It was peaceful there, away from the noise of town. Later that morning, after they came home, he let the dog out to roam in the yard. The gate was usually closed, but that day it didn't latch all the way. Maybe the wind pushed it, or maybe he forgot to check. Either way, the dog found the gap and wandered out, nose to the ground, exploring the quiet street. Across the road, a woman was walking her small dog. When she saw the large Malinois approaching, her heart raced. The big dog wasn't growling or barking, just curious, but she didn't know that. She picked up her little dog and hurried back to her car. A few minutes later, she made a call. "Hi, yes," she told the dispatcher. "There's a big, aggressive dog running loose near the corner of Oak and Mill. It looks dangerous." The dispatcher didn't ask many questions. It was a slow morning, and the report went straight to the nearest patrol car. 2 officers were already nearby. They'd been talking in the car about weekend plans when the radio crackled. "Loose dog, possibly aggressive. Respond to Oak and Mill." The officers weren't from that neighborhood. They didn't know the man or his dog. When they arrived, they saw the Malinois standing near a driveway, sniffing at a trash can. The dog turned his head and watched them, tail still, posture alert but calm. "Let's just catch him quick," one officer said, stepping out of the car. Neither had animal control training. They didn't carry catch poles or treats, just standard gear. The first officer tried to call the dog, whistling softly. The dog didn't move. He just looked at them, tilting his head. Inside the house, the man was in his garage working on a small wooden table he'd been repairing for a neighbor. He heard faint voices outside but didn't think much of it. The officers moved closer. One of them kept a hand near his holster. The other pulled out a flashlight even though it was bright outside. The dog took a step back, unsure. He barked once, a deep, sharp sound that echoed down the street. It wasn't a threat, just confusion. But to the officers it sounded like warning. "Hey, get back," one of them shouted. The dog barked again. Inside the garage, the man froze. He knew that sound, his dog's alert bark. It wasn't angry. It was calling for him. He dropped his tools and ran toward the front yard. The next few seconds moved too fast for anyone to understand. The officer closest to the dog raised his weapon, shouting something about, "Get control of your dog." The man opened the front door just as the sound of a single gunshot ripped through the air. The world went silent after that. The man stopped in his tracks. His dog lay on the edge of the driveway, motionless. For a moment, no one moved. The officers looked at each other, their faces pale. The man walked slowly toward the dog, his hands raised halfway, not out of fear but disbelief. He knelt beside the dog, touching his fur gently. The dog's chest rose once, then stopped. The man's eyes stayed fixed on him, as if willing him to wake up. His lips trembled, but no sound came out. One of the officers started to say something, but the words caught in his throat. "Sir, we thought he was coming at us." The man didn't answer. His face was calm, too calm, but his eyes, those eyes were something else. They didn't show rage or tears, just a depth of pain so strong it felt heavy in the air. A neighbor came out from across the street holding a phone, filming from a distance. Others peeked through windows. Someone whispered, "That's his dog. He's had that dog for years." The man placed a hand on the dog's head and closed his eyes for a moment. Then he stood up slowly. "You didn't have to shoot," he said quietly. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. The officers tried to explain, talking over each other. "Sir, the animal was approaching. We thought—" He didn't respond. He just turned, walked to his porch and sat down on the steps. His hands rested on his knees, steady. The world around him blurred. The sirens that followed, the gathering crowd, the radio chatter. He didn't hear any of it clearly. All he could hear was the silence that came after the gunshot. One of the officers radioed for backup and animal control. The other stood near the dog's body, shifting nervously, unsure what to do next. When the backup arrived, they began asking questions. What happened? Did the dog attack? But no one had a clear answer. Eventually, an animal control truck came. They covered the dog gently and took him away. The man sat there the whole time, not moving, not speaking. Later that day, a neighbor knocked on his door with a plate of food, trying to offer some comfort. He thanked her politely but didn't take it. He didn't eat that night. He just sat on the porch long after dark, staring at the empty yard. When the police report was written, it said, "The dog appeared aggressive and lunged toward the officer." But those who lived nearby told a different story. They said the dog never attacked anyone, that he was well-trained and calm. They said the officers overreacted. The man didn't go online to defend himself. He didn't call the station or the press. He just stayed quiet. But something inside him shifted that day. The calm, disciplined man who had spent years trying to find peace after war now felt the same cold stillness he had once known overseas. The difference was this time the battle came to his doorstep. That night he walked into the garage and sat beside the spot where his dog used to sleep. There was still a worn blanket there, a few toys, and a bowl half full of water. He placed his hand on the blanket and whispered, "You did good, boy." The next morning the sun rose the same way it always did. But the porch felt emptier, the air heavier. He didn't make coffee. He didn't walk down the gravel road. He just sat, staring at the woods, his thoughts drifting somewhere far away. He had spent years trying to forget who he was, the missions, the violence, the things he'd seen. But now that part of him stirred again, quiet but awake. The people in town still waved when they saw him, though now they did it from a little farther away. They didn't know what to say. They didn't know that behind his calm stare was a storm he was holding back, one that could change everything in the days to come. The next few days after the shooting felt like one long, heavy silence. The man didn't leave his house except to take out the trash. The neighbors tried to give him space. They understood loss, but they didn't understand the depth of what that dog meant to him. To them, it was a tragedy. To him, it was losing the one being that made his quiet life feel alive. He cleaned the yard the day after, moving slowly, as if every step reminded him of what had happened. The leash still hung by the door. The water bowl still sat by the porch. He couldn't bring himself to move them. The sound of paws on the floor, the gentle breathing at night all gone, the silence that filled those spaces hurt more than any wound he'd ever carried. The police department came by that afternoon. 2 officers, neither of them the ones who had fired the shot, stood at his door holding a clipboard. They said they wanted to take his statement for closure. He nodded and let them in. They spoke carefully, choosing their words like they were walking on thin ice. "We understand this has been difficult," one of them said. The man just nodded. He didn't want their sympathy. He wanted honesty. They asked questions: when he last saw the dog, if the gate was open, if the dog had ever shown aggression before. He answered every question plainly. No. Yes. He was trained. One officer looked uncomfortable, glancing around the neat, quiet house. "We're sorry for your loss," he said softly before they left. The man just stood there holding the paper they gave him, a copy of the report. When he finally read it that night, his jaw tightened. The words on the page felt cold, like the truth had been drained out of them. Dog displayed aggressive behavior. Officer discharged weapon in defense. It was written like a form, not like what really happened. He put the paper down and walked to the porch. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. He looked at the spot where his dog used to lie beside him and whispered, "You were never the threat." Word spread around town faster than he expected. Some people defended the officers. Others said it was a terrible mistake. Everyone had an opinion, but no one really knew him. The following morning, a local reporter came by asking for a comment. She was polite but persistent. "Sir, we're doing a story on the incident," she said. "Would you like to share your side?" He looked at her for a moment, then shook his head. "No side," he said quietly. "Only the truth. But the truth doesn't change anything." She hesitated, maybe expecting anger or tears, but he showed neither. She thanked him and left, leaving behind a small card with her number. He never called. That night he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw it again. The flash, the sound, the stillness after. He tried to breathe, tried to calm himself, but the images kept coming back. He had seen worse things before, but this one felt different. This wasn't a battlefield. This was home. In the days that followed, small details began to bother him. The way the police avoided his street. The way the department spokesperson described the incident on TV, calling it unfortunate but justified. The words didn't sit right. "Justified," he repeated quietly to himself. "What justifies killing something loyal?" A week passed, and he still hadn't heard anything more from the police. But one afternoon, a letter came in the mail. It was from the department. A short typed note expressing condolences, along with a suggestion that he could file a claim for property loss. He read that line twice. Property loss, that's what they called it. He put the letter down on the table and stared out the window. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. It wasn't just anger, it was disappointment. He had spent years serving his country, doing things most people couldn't even imagine. And now the people who were supposed to protect and understand the value of life were treating his as a form to be processed. That evening, he walked to the small park on the edge of town. It was the first time he had been outside for more than a few minutes. Kids were playing near the swings, and their laughter carried through the air. For a moment, it felt like another lifetime. He sat on a bench, closing his eyes, listening. He remembered how his dog used to sit beside him there, head on his knee, watching people pass by. Those memories came back in flashes. The way the dog barked softly at squirrels. The way he'd run to the water fountain to splash around like a child. He smiled faintly at the memory, but the smile faded quickly. The next morning, he went to the small shop downtown that sold flowers and picked up a bunch of white lilies. He walked to the animal cemetery outside of town where the shelter buried strays and lost pets. He found the spot they had given him for his dog and stood there quietly for a long time. He didn't cry. He just stood there, letting the breeze brush against his face. "You were the best part of me," he whispered. "I'll make sure you're remembered." When he left the cemetery, he noticed something strange. A black SUV parked a few spaces away, engine running. Two men inside, dressed too neatly to be from around there, watched him. When he looked in their direction, they quickly turned their heads. He didn't approach them. He didn't need to. He'd seen enough in his life to know when someone was watching. Back home, he sat down with his old laptop. It had been years since he opened the files that reminded him of who he used to be. But now, something inside him stirred again. He opened an encrypted folder filled with old mission reports, letters of commendation, and files marked classified. He stared at them for a long time. He didn't want revenge. He didn't want headlines. He just wanted the truth and respect. But experience had taught him that sometimes people only listened when you reminded them who you were. That evening, a knock came at his door. It was one of the officers, the younger one who had been there that day. His face looked drawn, tired. He held his cap in his hand. "Sir," the officer said quietly, "I came to say I'm sorry. I can't sleep since that day." The man didn't move. He looked at him for a moment and then said softly, "Do you know what discipline means?" The officer looked confused. "Sir?" "Discipline," he repeated. "It means control. Knowing when to act and when not to. It's the difference between strength and weakness. You had the weapon. You had the power, and you chose fear." The officer's eyes filled with regret. "I didn't mean to." He held up his hand. "I know, that's the problem. You didn't mean to, but you did." The officer lowered his head. "I understand," he said finally and walked away. When he was gone, the man stood by the window watching the sunset again. The light fell across the floor, warm and golden. For the first time in days, he felt something other than pain. He felt clarity. The following week, he received another visit, this time from two people in suits. They introduced themselves as representatives from a federal agency. They asked if he was the same person who had served overseas years ago. He said yes. They looked uneasy. "We're aware of your service record," one of them said. "We just want to make sure everything is okay." He smiled faintly. "It's fine," he said. "I'm just a man who lost his dog." But they knew better. They left soon after, leaving him alone again. That night, he took out an old notebook and began to write. Not about the past, but about the present. He wrote down what had happened, every detail, every word. It wasn't for revenge. It was for truth. He wanted people to know that even quiet men had limits, that every action had a ripple. Weeks passed. Life around town went back to normal. But for him, nothing was normal. The world had shifted. Every siren he heard made his chest tighten. Every bark from another dog brought a flash of memory. He tried to keep calm, to stay grounded. He fixed his fence, painted his porch, helped a neighbor move some boxes. Outwardly, he looked fine. Inside, though, he was rebuilding himself, carefully, piece by piece. He went for runs in the woods again, alone this time. He practiced his breathing, focused on his steps. Sometimes, when the wind blew through the trees just right, he swore he could hear his dog running beside him. One afternoon, as he was jogging down the trail, he saw the same black SUV parked by the entrance again. He slowed his pace but didn't stop. Whoever they were, they didn't approach. They just watched. He knew then that the world had noticed him again. Maybe it was because of who he used to be, or maybe because someone in the department had found out about his past. Either way, it didn't matter. He wasn't hiding and he wasn't afraid. When he returned home, he sat on the porch with a calm he hadn't felt in weeks. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the yard. He thought about everything he had lost, and everything he still had, the discipline, the strength, the patience. He whispered softly into the quiet evening, "They took my peace, but not my purpose." And as the wind rustled through the trees, it almost felt like an answer. Days turned into weeks and life in town seemed to move on. People talked less about what had happened. The story that once filled local news faded behind new headlines. For most, it was already old news. But for him, every day was a quiet reminder that some things don't fade just because others stop mentioning them. He spent most mornings sitting on his porch with a cup of coffee, the same way he always did before everything changed. But now the porch felt emptier. The leash still hung by the door. Sometimes he caught himself turning his head, expecting to see a familiar shadow beside him. Every small habit still carried traces of the life he had shared with his dog. He tried to fill his days with small tasks, fixing things around the house, repairing tools, mowing the yard for the elderly couple down the street. He had always believed that keeping his hands busy helped keep his mind steady. But no matter how many things he fixed, there was something inside him that stayed broken. One morning, as he was cleaning his garage, he heard the sound of footsteps outside. When he stepped out, he saw a young man standing near the edge of the driveway, holding a small camera. The man froze when he noticed him. "Sorry," the young man said quickly. "I didn't mean to bother you. I'm doing a school project about local stories. You're the guy from the dog thing, right?" He didn't answer right away. He didn't like how the word sounded. The dog thing, as if it were a simple story, not a piece of his life. The young man looked nervous. I just wanted to hear what really happened. There's a lot of stuff online and people are saying different things. He sighed softly. Everything you need to know is already out there, he said. The rest doesn't change what happened. The young man nodded awkwardly, sensing the conversation was over. He apologized again and left. After that, he noticed more people driving slowly past his house. Some were curious. Others just wanted to see the place where it happened. He didn't blame them, but it made him uneasy. He had spent his life avoiding attention, and now he couldn't seem to escape it. Later that week, he went to the grocery store for the first time in a while. As he walked down the aisles, a few people glanced his way, whispering softly. A woman at the checkout smiled politely, but her eyes showed pity. He didn't want pity. He wanted space. When he got home, he sat on the porch again and thought about everything that had unfolded. The more he thought, the more he realized that peace doesn't come from forgetting. It comes from accepting. But acceptance was something he hadn't yet found. That night, as he sat in the quiet, he heard a soft knock on his door. It was his neighbor from across the street holding a small tin of cookies. I just thought you might like something sweet, she said gently. It's been a hard time, I know. He gave her a small smile. Thank you, he said. That's kind of you. She hesitated for a moment before speaking again. I wanted to tell you. I saw what happened that day. I was on my porch. Your dog didn't do anything wrong. He looked at her quietly, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. I tried to tell them, she continued. When they took statements, I said it wasn't the dog's fault. But they didn't write it down the way I said it. They made it sound different. He nodded slowly. I believe you, he said. She placed the tin on the small table by his chair. People forget things fast, she said softly. But I didn't want you to think everyone did. After she left, he sat for a long time thinking about what she said. It reminded him that truth has a way of surviving, even when people try to twist it. The next morning, he got up early and drove to the nearby town. There was a small veterans center there where he used to go for therapy sessions years ago. He hadn't been there since he moved. The building looked the same. Plain walls, a flag out front, a few cars in the lot. When he walked in, the receptionist recognized him right away. It's been a while, she said warmly. Good to see you again, he nodded. I just needed a quiet place for a while. She pointed him to the back room where a small group of veterans were having coffee. They looked up when he walked in, nodding and greeting. One of them smiled and motioned for him to sit down. They talked about simple things at first. The weather, the news, the price of gas. But eventually one of them asked, You doing okay, brother? You look like you've been carrying something heavy. He looked down for a moment before answering. Lost my dog, he said quietly. The room went still for a second. Then one of the older men spoke. That's rough, he said softly. People don't understand, but sometimes that dog's the only thing that keeps you grounded. He nodded. They didn't need the details. They just understood. They talked for hours about service, about loss, about the strange silence that follows after years of noise. He hadn't realized how much he missed talking to people who understood that kind of silence. Before he left, one of the men handed him a small card with a phone number on it. Call me if you ever feel the quiet's getting too loud, he said with a half smile. When he got home that evening, the air felt lighter. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel completely alone, but peace has a way of being fragile. The next morning, he woke up to the sound of knocking again. This time it wasn't a neighbor or a reporter. It was two officers in uniform. They looked tense. Sir, one of them began. We just wanted to let you know that the internal review for the incident has been completed. He stood quietly in the doorway. And, the officer shifted uncomfortably. It was ruled as justified use of force. He didn't say a word. He just looked at them, his face calm. But his eyes told a story they couldn't read. I know this isn't what you wanted to hear, the other officer added quickly, but we're really sorry for what happened. He nodded once. Thank you for telling me. They left and he closed the door behind them slowly. The words echoed in his mind. Justified. The same word that had followed him since that day. That night, he sat outside again. The stars were bright, the air cool. He thought about all the times he had seen men justify their actions in war. Sometimes they were right, sometimes they weren't. But this was different. This wasn't about an enemy. This was about carelessness, about fear. He knew that arguing wouldn't change anything. He also knew that silence sometimes spoke louder than words. So instead of fighting, he decided to do something else. He began writing again, not just about what had happened, but about his life. About the lessons he'd learned in service, about loyalty, about control, about loss. He wrote as if he were talking to his dog, telling him everything he wished he could say one more time. Day by day, the writing became a kind of healing. Each word helped him release a bit of the pain. Some days he cried quietly while writing. Other days he smiled at the memories. One afternoon, as he sat writing, he heard a car pull up outside. When he looked through the window, he saw a familiar black SUV again. This time, only one man stepped out. He wore plain clothes but carried himself with authority. The man walked up to the porch. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. He nodded. The visitor looked out toward the trees for a moment before speaking. "You know, a lot of people at the department didn't know who you were. They didn't realize your record. If they had, things might have gone differently." He stayed quiet. The visitor continued. "There are people who think you might want to retaliate or make trouble, but I told them you're not that kind of man." He turned to look at him finally. "I'm not," he said simply. "But I am the kind who remembers." The visitor nodded slowly. "That's what makes people nervous." There was a long silence before the visitor stood up. "If you ever need help, official or not, call this number," he said, handing him a small card. Then he walked back to his car and drove off. The man sat there for a while, holding the card between his fingers. He didn't plan to call, but it reminded him that his past hadn't disappeared. It was just waiting quietly in the background. That evening, he walked down to the lake outside town. The sun was setting and the water reflected the sky like a mirror. He sat by the shore, listening to the wind. For a moment, he felt something close to peace. He realized that even though the world around him had judged, moved on, or misunderstood, he still had control over what came next. He couldn't bring back what was gone, but he could choose how to carry it. As the last light faded, he whispered softly, "You'd have liked it here tonight, boy." And somewhere inside him the heavy weight began to lift. Not gone, but lighter than before. A few months passed and the quiet of his life slowly returned, though it wasn't the same kind of quiet as before. It wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, thick with memory. The days felt long, the nights even longer. But time, as it always does, kept moving forward, carrying him with it even when he didn't feel ready. People in the neighborhood still greeted him when they saw him, but most didn't stop to talk anymore. They didn't know what to say, and he didn't mind. He preferred it that way. He had learned to live with silence. Sometimes he even found comfort in it. Each morning he woke before sunrise and sat on the porch with his coffee, just watching the light come through the trees. It was a ritual now. He had stopped expecting anything from the world. No apologies, no justice, no understanding. But he still had his routine, and that was enough to get through the days. One morning, as the fog lifted from the woods, he noticed a letter slipped under his door. It wasn't in an envelope, just a folded sheet of paper with his name written neatly on top. He opened it slowly. It wasn't from anyone local. The handwriting was precise, the kind used by people who had been trained to write without emotion. It said only a few lines. What happened shouldn't have. Some of us remember who you were and what you did for this country. Stay calm, stay quiet. You were being watched not for harm, but for safety. He read the note twice, then folded it carefully and placed it on the table. He wasn't sure whether to feel comforted or uneasy. Either way, he wasn't surprised. He had known since the first time he saw the black SUV that someone had taken interest in him again. That day, he decided to take a drive. He didn't have a destination, just a need to move. The open road had always helped him think. He rolled down the windows and let the cool air wash over him. It was early autumn, and the trees were beginning to change colors, filling the hills with gold and red. He drove for hours, passing through small towns and empty fields. At one point, he stopped by a roadside diner to eat. The waitress smiled kindly and poured him coffee without asking. "You passing through?" she asked. He nodded. "Just driving." She nodded back, understanding the kind of quiet that comes from people who are searching for something they can't quite name. After a long pause, she said softly, "Sometimes getting lost is the best way to find peace." He smiled faintly. Maybe, he said. When he returned home that evening, the house felt different. Not in a bad way, just unfamiliar. He had been gone only a day, but it was as if something had shifted. He sat down at his desk and opened his notebook, the one where he had been writing about everything that had happened. The pages were now half full. Some were messy with crossed-out words and smudges, others neat and clear. He wasn't writing for anyone else. He wrote because it helped him breathe, because the paper didn't judge or interrupt. That night, he wrote something new. Sometimes silence isn't peace. It's just the place where pain rests until you decide what to do with it. After writing, he closed the notebook and looked out the window. The street was empty, but he could see faint headlights in the distance. Slow, steady, like someone was watching again. He didn't feel anger this time, only understanding. People fear what they can't control. The next morning, he went to the Veterans Center again. It had become a small anchor in his week. He didn't talk much when he was there, but sitting with others who carried invisible scars made him feel less alone. That day, a new counselor was visiting, a quiet man with kind eyes. During the group session, he asked everyone to talk about something they had lost that shaped who they became afterward. When it was his turn, he hesitated. I lost trust, he said simply. The counselor nodded slowly. In people? In everything, he replied. But I'm learning it's not about getting it back. It's about living without needing it. The room was silent for a moment. The counselor gave a small smile. That's a hard lesson, but a strong one. After the session, one of the veterans followed him outside. You ever think about writing a book? He asked. He shook his head. Not really. You should, the man said. People need to hear real stories. Not the kind that get cleaned up for the news. The kind that come from the heart. He didn't respond right away, but the words stayed with him. That evening he went home and opened his notebook again. He began to write about more than the day of the shooting. He wrote about his time in service, about what it felt like to come home after years of war, and realized that home was the hardest battlefield to understand. The more he wrote, the lighter he felt. It wasn't about making people understand him. It was about understanding himself again. Weeks went by, and he noticed something unexpected happening. Letters began to arrive in his mailbox. Some were from people he didn't know, veterans, dog owners, strangers from other towns who had heard a version of his story. They wrote things like, I know what it's like to lose a friend like that, or your story reminded me to be strong. He never asked for attention, but the kindness in those words touched him. He realized his pain had somehow become a bridge for others who were hurting. One evening, as he was reading one of the letters, there was another knock at his door. This time it was a man in plain clothes again, the same one who had visited before. The man looked serious but not threatening. You've been writing, he said. He nodded. I have. It's getting noticed, the man said. People are talking about it online. Some see it as a message. Some think it's something else. He shrugged slightly. It's just truth, the man nodded. That's what worries them. Truth makes people uncomfortable. He smiled faintly. Then maybe it's doing something right. The visitor looked at him for a long moment before saying quietly, just keep it peaceful. The world listens better when you speak calmly. I know, he said. I'm not looking for trouble. I'm just done being silent. After the man left, he went back inside and sat by the window. The night air was cool, the sky filled with stars. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel angry or watched, just present. He picked up his pen again and wrote another line. Peace isn't the absence of noise. It's when the noise no longer controls you. Over the next few weeks, his writing continued to spread quietly online. People shared his words under titles like The Man Who Lost His Dog But Found His Voice. He didn't respond to the comments or messages, but he read some of them. Many thanked him for speaking about things they couldn't. One afternoon, he received an invitation from a local radio host who ran a small community program. They wanted him to come on air to share his thoughts on healing, not to talk about the incident, but about life afterward. He almost said no, but something inside told him it was time to speak. When he arrived at the small radio station, the host greeted him warmly. We don't want drama, she said. Just honesty, he nodded. That's all I have. During the interview, she asked simple questions about loss, forgiveness, and how to keep moving forward when the world feels unfair. His answers were quiet but steady. "Forgiveness isn't about saying what happened was okay," he said. "It's about not letting it control your peace." The host looked moved. "That's powerful," she said. After the interview aired, people in town began to see him differently. He wasn't just the man from the tragedy anymore. He was someone who had faced pain and turned it into something meaningful. Still, not everyone was happy. A few officials didn't like the attention his words were bringing, but they couldn't do anything about it. He wasn't breaking any rules, just speaking his truth. The following week, he returned to the animal cemetery. The grass had grown tall and the flowers he'd left before had withered. He knelt down and replaced them with fresh ones. He sat there quietly for a while, talking softly as if his old friend could still hear him. "We're okay," he whispered. "You'd be proud." The wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of pine through the air. For a moment, he closed his eyes and smiled. When he got back home, he found another envelope waiting for him. This one was thicker, stamped with a seal he recognized from his service days. Inside was a short letter thanking him for his continued strength and composure in the face of public attention. It ended with a single line that made him pause. "You remind people that control doesn't mean silence, it means choosing your response." He folded the letter and set it next to the others. Then he turned off the lights, sat by the window, and watched the streetlights glow softly against the quiet night. For the first time since everything began, he didn't feel haunted. He felt grounded. The world had changed, but so had he. And maybe in some quiet way that was enough. Months went by quietly. The seasons shifted again, and with them, so did the air in his life. The pain never fully left, but it changed shape. It no longer controlled him the way it once did. Instead of anger, he carried understanding. Instead of sadness, there was memory. The small house where he lived felt different now. It wasn't empty anymore. It was calm. He had filled it with small signs of life again. A few plants by the window, a wooden frame with a picture of his dog, a book left open on the table. It looked lived in, not haunted. Each morning he still woke early, made his coffee, and watched the sunrise from the porch. The sky never failed to remind him that every day could begin again, no matter how dark the night before had been. The people in the neighborhood had started greeting him more often again. They smiled now, not out of pity but out of respect. Some had watched the radio interview. Others had read pieces of his writing. They didn't see a broken man anymore. They saw someone who had rebuilt himself without bitterness. He didn't speak much about what had happened. He didn't need to. The story had already traveled far on its own, carried by whispers, articles, and the quiet admiration of strangers. But what mattered most to him wasn't fame or sympathy. It was peace. One day, while checking his mail, he found an invitation. It was from a local community college. They were holding a small event about resilience and personal strength, and they wanted him to share his story. At first, he thought about refusing. He wasn't a speaker. He was just a man who had been through something painful. But as he looked at the letter again, he thought about all the people who had written to him, the ones who said his words helped them heal. Maybe he could help a few more. He accepted the invitation. The night of the event, the hall was modest, with about 50 people seated in rows of folding chairs. There were students, teachers, veterans, and a few familiar faces from town. When he walked to the front, the room grew still. He stood there for a moment, looking out at everyone. He didn't hold any notes. He didn't need to rehearse. He simply began to speak from the heart. "I'm not here to talk about what happened that day," he said softly. "Most of you already know that part. I'm here to talk about what came after. The silence, the confusion, and the choice to live again." He paused, letting the words settle. When something breaks your world apart, you think that's it. You think you'll never find peace again. But you do. Not all at once, and not the same kind of peace as before. But something new, something honest. He talked about forgiveness, about patience, and about learning to exist with pain instead of fighting it every day. His words weren't fancy or polished. They were simple, steady, and true. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then people began to clap softly at first, then louder. A few stood. He didn't know what to do except smile and nod. He wasn't looking for applause, but the warmth in that moment touched him deeply. Afterward, several people came up to thank him. One young man said, "You made me realize I can start over too."